The moment a man chooses pride over family, he starts losing both. The crystal champagne flute slipped from a server's hand and shattered across the marble floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the Grand Regency ballroom. Nearly 300 guests turned toward the sound, but within seconds, their attention shifted to something far more shocking. Standing beneath a glittering chandelier worth more than most American homes, billionaire Richard Whitmore slowly raised his glass. At 68 years old, the founder of Whitmore Holdings commanded attention without effort. His silver hair was perfectly combed. His tuxedo fit like it had been tailored that morning. Every senator, CEO, investor, and socialite in attendance knew one thing about Richard Whitmore: when he spoke, people listened. The annual Whitmore Foundation Gala was supposed to celebrate another year of charitable success. Instead, it was about to become the night his family fractured in front of the entire city. Richard glanced toward his only son. Ethan Whitmore stood near the center of the ballroom, his hand firmly holding Naomi Carter's. Ethan looked calm. Naomi looked composed. But the whispers surrounding them had been growing louder all evening. Everyone knew why. Naomi Carter wasn't from their world. She wasn't listed in business magazines. She didn't come from old money. She didn't attend Ivy League fundraisers or private yacht events. She was a public school teacher from Baltimore, and a single mother raising her 7-year-old daughter. To many of the guests, that was all they needed to know. Richard set down his glass. The room fell silent. Even the string quartet near the stage stopped playing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice smooth and controlled. "Many of you have heard certain rumors involving my son." Several guests exchanged knowing glances. Ethan's jaw tightened. Naomi remained still. Richard continued. "Tonight I can confirm those rumors are true." A ripple moved through the crowd. Crystal chandeliers reflected against polished marble as hundreds of eyes locked onto the Whitmore family. "My son has decided to marry Naomi Carter." More whispers. More stares. Somewhere near the back of the room, someone quietly gasped. Ethan squeezed Naomi's hand. Richard paused long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. Then he delivered the sentence nobody expected. "If Ethan chooses this marriage, he will no longer be a member of my family." The words landed heavier than thunder. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Cameras lowered. Conversations died. Across the ballroom, Naomi's daughter Lily looked up from her seat, confusion filling her young eyes. Ethan stepped forward. "Dad, no." Richard's voice remained calm. "This is not a negotiation." The billionaire turned toward the crowd as if discussing quarterly earnings instead of his own son. "Every family leaves a legacy. Every generation protects what previous generations built. I will not support a decision that puts that legacy at risk." The statement sounded polished. Reasonable. Almost noble. Yet something about it made the room colder. Ethan stared at his father. "You're willing to lose your son over this?" Richard met his gaze without hesitation. "That choice belongs to you." Around them, the city's elite watched like spectators at a championship game. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed fascinated. A few appeared quietly satisfied. Naomi remained silent through all of it. She neither defended herself nor challenged Richard. That silence only fueled the whispers spreading through the ballroom. Gold digger. Opportunist. Mistake. The labels floated from table to table. Yet Naomi showed no reaction. Her expression never changed. As if she had heard every insult before. As if none of them mattered. And somewhere beyond the grand ballroom doors, completely unnoticed by everyone inside, a black sedan pulled into the circular driveway. The driver stepped out first. Then a tall man emerged from the rear passenger seat. The security staff immediately straightened. One guard reached for his radio. Another adjusted his jacket. Because the man walking toward the entrance wasn't just another guest. And before the night was over, his arrival would change everything. The silence that followed Richard Whitmore's declaration seemed to stretch forever. Naomi Carter could feel hundreds of eyes fixed on her from every corner of the ballroom. The crystal chandeliers above reflected gold across the polished floor, but the room no longer felt warm. It felt like a courtroom. Every glance carried judgment. Every whisper felt measured. Yet Naomi stood perfectly still beside Ethan. She had spent most of her life learning how to remain calm when people decided who she was before ever speaking to her. 7 years earlier, she had been standing in a very different room, a cramped apartment just outside Baltimore, staring at overdue bills spread across a folding table while her infant daughter slept in a second-hand crib. Back then, nobody had cared about her name. Nobody had cared about her future. They only saw a young black woman raising a child alone. Some people offered sympathy. Many offered criticism. Almost everyone offered assumptions. Naomi remembered working double shifts while studying at night. She remembered grading papers after midnight once she became a teacher. She remembered skipping meals so Lily would never have to. Through it all, she learned something important. The people who judged her the fastest usually knew her the least. Across the ballroom, a woman in an emerald designer gown leaned toward her companion. Naomi caught part of the sentence. She knew exactly what she was doing. Another guest quietly nodded. You do not end up with a Whitmore by accident. The comments were not new. Social media had been worse. Business blogs had been worse. Even local news stations had questioned Ethan's decision when photographs of the couple first surfaced. Some articles described Naomi as an opportunist. Others suggested she was manipulating Ethan for financial security. Almost none of them mentioned her master's degree. None mentioned the scholarship programs she helped create for underprivileged students. None mentioned the years she spent volunteering on weekends. None of those details fit the story people preferred to tell. Ethan looked toward her. You do not have to stay for this. Naomi offered a small smile. I am not leaving because strangers are uncomfortable. Ethan almost laughed despite the tension. That was one of the reasons he loved her. She never performed strength. She simply possessed it. Nearby, Lily sat quietly at a round table, her small hands folded in her lap. The 7-year-old could sense something was wrong even if she did not fully understand it. Her eyes moved between Ethan, Naomi, and Richard. Children often understood emotions faster than adults. Mom? She asked softly. Naomi turned immediately. Yes, sweetheart? Did we do something bad? The question landed harder than any insult in the room. Naomi crossed the floor and knelt beside her daughter. No, baby. Then why is everybody looking at us? Around them, conversation stopped. Several guests pretended not to listen while listening to every word. Naomi gently brushed a curl away from Lily's forehead. Sometimes people make up stories when they do not know the truth. Lily considered that. Like at school when somebody blames the wrong kid? Naomi smiled. Exactly like that. Lily nodded slowly. The answer seemed to satisfy her. But it unsettled several adults standing nearby. Because while they had spent the evening discussing Naomi, almost none of them actually knew her. Richard Whitmore watched the exchange from across the room. For a brief moment, something flickered in his expression. Not regret. Not yet. Perhaps uncertainty. It vanished almost immediately. Decades of business negotiations had taught him never to second-guess himself publicly. He adjusted his cufflinks and resumed greeting influential guests. Yet whispers continued spreading through the ballroom. Some defended him. Others questioned him. And among the crowd, one elderly man standing near the back had become unusually quiet. His attention was fixed on Naomi. More specifically, on the small silver pendant resting near her collarbone. He narrowed his eyes. Then looked again. His face changed. The color seemed to drain slightly from his features. Because he recognized that pendant. And if he was right about where it came from, then almost everyone in this room had misunderstood exactly who Naomi Carter was. The elderly man could not take his eyes off the pendant. While conversations continued around him, his attention remained fixed on the small silver emblem resting against Naomi Carter's navy blue dress. He had seen that symbol only a handful of times during the past 20 years, and never by accident. His name was Harold Bennett, a retired federal judge and longtime donor to the Whitmore Foundation. At 76 years old, Harold had attended enough high-profile events to recognize when something did not fit the story everyone believed. Slowly, he stepped closer. Across the ballroom, Naomi was helping Lily finish a glass of sparkling cider when Harold finally reached them. "Excuse me," he said politely. Naomi turned. "Yes, sir?" Harold gestured toward the pendant. "May I ask where you got that necklace?" Ethan noticed the unusual seriousness in the older man's voice. Naomi looked down briefly. The silver pendant was simple and worn, nothing like the diamonds displayed throughout the room. "It belonged to my grandmother," she answered. "She gave it to me before she passed away." Harold swallowed. "And before her?" Naomi hesitated. "My family has had it for generations, or at least that is what I was told." Harold stared for several seconds. Then he nodded slowly, as though confirming something in his own mind. "Remarkable." Before Naomi could ask another question, Harold excused himself and walked away. But he did not look relieved. He looked concerned. Nearby guests immediately noticed the exchange. Whispers resumed. Some wondered if the pendant contained hidden value. Others assumed Harold was simply being sentimental. Yet the retired judge moved directly toward a quiet corner of the ballroom and pulled out his phone. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. When he ended it, his expression remained troubled. Across the room, Richard Whitmore was speaking with several investors when one of them casually mentioned the conversation. Richard glanced toward Naomi. "What was that about?" he asked. "No idea," the investor replied. "But Bennett looked like he had seen a ghost." Richard frowned. He disliked surprises, especially at his own events. Meanwhile, Ethan led Naomi toward a quieter section near the ballroom windows overlooking the city skyline. The lights of Manhattan stretched across the darkness like a sea of stars. For a moment, the noise behind them faded. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked softly. Naomi exhaled. "I have been better." Ethan looked guilty. "I never wanted you or Lily dragged into this." Naomi turned toward him. "Ethan, look at me." He did. "None of this changes who we are. My father seems determined to test that theory." Naomi smiled faintly. "Then let him." Something about her confidence eased him. It always had. From the day they met at a charity reading program 3 years earlier, Naomi possessed a calm that made chaos seem smaller. She never chased approval. She never tried to impress powerful people. In many ways, that was exactly what fascinated Ethan. Most people treated the Whitmore name like a golden ticket. Naomi treated it like a last name. Across the ballroom, Lily sat drawing with crayons provided by the event staff. She was sketching a picture of 3 people holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. A woman passing by smiled at the drawing. "That is beautiful," Lily pointed proudly. "That is me, my mom, and Ethan." "What about your grandfather?" the woman asked casually. Lily tilted her head. "Which one?" The woman laughed awkwardly and continued walking. But the innocent question lingered. Because very few people in the room knew anything about Naomi's family. That mystery had allowed assumptions to flourish. Yet assumptions are fragile things. They survive only until facts arrive. Near the entrance, 2 security supervisors suddenly adjusted their earpieces. One straightened his jacket. Another quietly opened a side pathway normally reserved for government officials and distinguished guests. Several observant attendees noticed the unusual activity. A murmur spread through the room. Something was changing. Nobody knew what. Nobody knew why. But the atmosphere had shifted. Even Richard Whitmore sensed it. He stopped speaking mid-conversation and glanced toward the ballroom doors. The confidence that had carried him all evening remained firmly in place. Yet somewhere deep inside, a small thread of uncertainty had begun to pull. Because outside the Grand Regency ballroom, the black sedan had not left. And the man who stepped out of it was now only moments away from entering the room. The ballroom doors remained closed, but everyone could feel the change in the atmosphere. It was subtle at first, like the pressure shift before a storm. Conversations became shorter. Laughter sounded forced. Even the musicians seemed distracted as they adjusted their sheet music and glanced repeatedly toward the entrance. Richard Whitmore noticed it too. For decades he had built an empire by reading rooms faster than anyone else. He understood confidence. He understood fear. And right now, something neither belonged to him nor remained under his control. Across the ballroom, Naomi Carter stood beside Ethan while Lily colored another page. She seemed unaffected by the growing tension, which only made certain guests more uncomfortable. One woman in a diamond necklace worth more than a luxury car studied Naomi carefully. "How is she so calm?" she whispered. Her husband shrugged. "Maybe she does not realize what she is losing," another guest overheard. "Or maybe she knows something we do not." The comment lingered. Because more and more people were beginning to notice small details that did not fit the story they had created. Naomi never acted impressed by wealth. She never seemed intimidated by power. She moved through the ballroom with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged anywhere she chose to stand. That confidence was difficult to explain if she truly was everything people claimed she was. Near the stage, Harold Bennett continued watching from a distance. His phone remained in his hand. Every few minutes he checked the time. Waiting. Anticipating. His expression grew more serious with each passing second. Ethan finally turned toward Naomi. "There is something I have wanted to ask all night." Naomi smiled slightly. "Only one thing?" "Fair point." He laughed softly. "Why did you never tell me more about your family?" Naomi glanced toward Lily. "Because family is complicated. Complicated enough to make a retired federal judge look like he saw a ghost?" Naomi looked genuinely surprised. "Judge Bennett?" Ethan nodded. "He recognized your pendant." Naomi touched the silver necklace unconsciously. For a moment, memories crossed her face. Old memories. Important memories. Then the expression disappeared. "My grandmother always told me never to take it off." "Did she say why?" Naomi looked toward the ballroom entrance. "She said someday the right people would recognize it." Ethan waited for more. None came. Before he could ask another question, a movement near the doorway caught everyone's attention. 2 security officers had taken positions on either side of the entrance. The ballroom manager appeared moments later, speaking quietly into an earpiece. Several prominent guests immediately noticed. One investor lowered his drink. Another stopped mid-conversation. The reactions spread like ripples across water. Something important was happening. Richard stepped forward. "What is going on?" he asked one of the event coordinators. "I am not sure, sir." The answer irritated him. Richard Whitmore was accustomed to having answers. The uncertainty only deepened his frustration. Then another strange thing happened. 3 guests near the front of the ballroom suddenly stood up. Not because anyone instructed them to. Not because a speech had begun. They simply rose from their seats and turned toward the entrance. A former governor followed. Then a decorated military officer. Then the chairman of a major banking institution. Confusion swept through the room. Why were they standing? Who were they waiting for? Even Richard looked unsettled now. The doors had still not opened, yet some of the most influential people in attendance were already reacting. Naomi noticed it too. Her expression softened in a way Ethan had never seen before. Not nervousness. Not fear. Something closer to anticipation. Beside her, Lily suddenly looked up from her drawing. A bright smile appeared on her face. "Mom." Naomi looked down. "What is it, sweetheart?" Lily pointed directly toward the ballroom entrance. "I know that car." Ethan followed her gaze. Naomi's heartbeat quickened for the first time all evening. Because beyond the doors, she recognized exactly who had arrived. And within seconds everyone else was about to learn why the assumptions they had spent the entire night believing were about to collapse. The massive ballroom doors finally opened. The sound was not dramatic. It was quiet. Controlled. Yet somehow that made every head turn even faster. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Crystal glasses froze halfway to lips. The entire room seemed to hold a collective breath as a tall man stepped inside. He was in his early 70s, broad-shouldered despite his age, wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit with no visible attempt to impress anyone. He did not need to. Some people carried authority the way others carried expensive watches. It followed them naturally. The moment he crossed the threshold, 3 retired military officers stood immediately. Then a former governor rose from his chair. Then another guest. And another. Within seconds, nearly a dozen influential people throughout the ballroom were on their feet. Richard Whitmore's expression changed for the silence lasted only a few seconds, but to everyone inside the Grand Regency ballroom it felt much longer. Richard Whitmore had spent years controlling conversations, negotiations, and headlines. Yet for the first time that evening, he seemed to be searching for the right words and finding none. Around the room, guests who had spent hours quietly judging Naomi now looked almost embarrassed by their own assumptions. Marcus Carter did not appear interested in their reactions. His attention remained on his daughter and granddaughter. Lily wrapped her arms around his waist while he smiled down at her with unmistakable affection. It was a simple moment, but it carried more weight than any speech delivered that night. Ethan finally broke the silence. "You never told me." Naomi looked at him gently. "You never asked?" A few guests laughed nervously. Ethan shook his head, still trying to process everything. "Your father is General Marcus Carter." Naomi nodded. "Yes. One of the most respected public figures in the country. That is what the newspapers say." Ethan stared at her for another second before laughing softly. "And you teach third-grade math." "I like teaching third-grade math." The answer drew genuine smiles from several people nearby. For the first time all evening, the atmosphere began shifting away from judgment and toward curiosity. Richard watched the exchange carefully. Something about Naomi's response unsettled him even more. Most people would have showcased the connection like Marcus Carter. Most people would have mentioned it immediately. Most people would have used it as leverage. Naomi had done none of those things. She had walked into one of the most intimidating social environments in the country, and never once mentioned who her father was. That fact alone forced Richard to reconsider assumptions he had accepted as truth. Marcus turned toward him. "Richard, may we talk?" The request sounded polite, but it immediately commanded attention. Richard nodded. "Of course." They stepped a short distance away, though not far enough to escape the attention of the room. People pretended to return to their conversations while listening closely. Marcus spoke first. "I understand you have concerns about my daughter." Richard straightened his posture. "My concerns were never personal." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "No?" Richard hesitated. The answer sounded less convincing now than it had 2 hours earlier. Marcus continued calmly. "Naomi was offered opportunities her entire life because of my position. She turned most of them down." Richard remained silent. "She wanted her achievements to belong to her." Marcus glanced toward Naomi. "She earned scholarships without using my name. Built a career without using my influence. Raised an extraordinary child without asking anyone for favors." Several guests lowered their eyes. The contrast between the rumors and reality was becoming difficult to ignore. Marcus smiled faintly. "Frankly, Richard, I have spent years trying to convince her that accepting help is not a weakness." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the crowd. Richard forced a smile. Yet the more Marcus spoke, the worse he felt. Not because Marcus was attacking him. Quite the opposite. Marcus remained gracious, respectful, reasonable. That made the situation harder. There was no villain standing in front of him. No threat. No manipulation. Only a father defending a daughter who had done nothing wrong. Nearby, Harold Bennett approached Ethan. "Your father made a mistake." Ethan looked surprised by the directness. Harold sighed. "The unfortunate thing about mistakes is that sometimes we make them publicly." Across the ballroom, Naomi stood watching quietly. She was not enjoying Richard's discomfort. She was not seeking revenge. In fact, her expression carried something closer to sadness. She had never wanted this confrontation. She had only wanted acceptance. And that realization struck Ethan harder than anything else. Because while everyone focused on status, reputation, and influence, Naomi had been focused on family. The very thing Richard claimed to value most. Then Marcus reached into his jacket and removed a small worn photograph. He handed it to Richard. Richard looked down. The image showed a much younger Naomi standing beside her grandmother, both smiling on the front porch of a modest home. Around Naomi's neck hung the same silver pendant. Marcus spoke quietly. My mother told her that character matters more than titles. Richard stared at the photograph. For the first time that evening, he could not escape a painful truth. The person he had spent hours judging might have been the one person in the room who never cared about status at all. Richard Whitmore remained frozen with the photograph in his hands long after Marcus Carter stopped speaking. Around him, the ballroom had changed in a way no amount of wealth could reverse. Earlier that evening, people had watched Naomi as an outsider. The remainder of the evening should have belonged to the Whitmore Foundation. It should have been remembered for charitable donations, business partnerships, and elegant speeches beneath crystal chandeliers. Instead, everyone understood they were witnessing something far more significant. They were watching a man confront the consequences of his own assumptions. Richard Whitmore stood quietly near the ballroom windows while conversations slowly resumed around him. The city lights beyond the glass stretched across the horizon, but his attention remained fixed on the folded drawing inside his jacket pocket. Families are supposed to be together. The simple words echoed in his mind again and again. Across the room, Naomi sat beside Marcus and Lily while Ethan spoke with several guests. The difference now was impossible to miss. Earlier that evening, many of those same guests had treated Naomi with polite distance. Now they approached her with genuine respect. Yet something interesting happened. Naomi never changed. She did not stand taller. She did not become more confident. She did not suddenly seek attention. She behaved exactly as she had before. The only thing that changed was how other people saw her. Marcus noticed it too. Funny, is it not? He said quietly. Naomi smiled. What is? You are still the same woman you were 3 hours ago. Naomi laughed softly. I hope so. Marcus nodded. Yet half this room thinks you became someone new. Nearby, Ethan overheard and smiled. The observation was painfully accurate. Nothing about Naomi had changed. Only the story others had invented about her. Harold Bennett soon joined them carrying a glass of sparkling water. You know, he said, looking toward Naomi, I spent 30 years in courtrooms. Most mistakes happen because people believe they already know the whole story. Marcus raised an eyebrow. And the rest? Harold smiled. Because they never ask questions. Across the ballroom, Richard finally began moving. Several guests watched with curiosity as he crossed the room. The path was not long, yet it seemed to take considerable effort. Pride is a strange thing. It builds walls slowly and tears them down reluctantly. When Richard stopped in front of Naomi, conversations quieted once more. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Naomi stood. Ethan immediately stepped beside her. Marcus remained seated, though his eyes followed every movement. Richard looked at Naomi first. Then Ethan. For several seconds he said nothing. The silence felt heavier than any speech. Finally he spoke. I owe both of you an apology. The words surprised the room. Richard Whitmore was many things. Public apologies were not among them. Ethan stared at his father. Richard continued. I convinced myself I was protecting my family. His voice remained steady, but the certainty that once defined it was gone. The truth is that I stopped listening to the people who mattered most. Naomi remained quiet. Richard looked directly at her. I judged you without knowing you. The honesty in the statement carried more weight than any elaborate explanation could have. Nearby guests lowered their eyes again. Many had done exactly the same thing. Richard glanced toward Lily. The little girl looked back curiously. A small smile touched his face. The gala ended hours later, but the story did not. Some nights fade into memory before sunrise. Others become turning points that quietly reshape lives. For everyone who attended the Whitmore Foundation Gala, that evening would be remembered for years. Not because of the guest list. Not because of the donations announced from the stage. But because they witnessed how quickly assumptions can crumble when truth finally enters the room. 3 months later, spring sunlight poured through the stained glass windows of a small church overlooking the Hudson River. It was not the largest venue available. It was not the most expensive. In fact, several event planners had offered grander options once news of Naomi's family background became public. She declined every one of them. Ethan was not surprised. Naomi had never cared about appearances. She cared about people. The church filled slowly with friends, teachers, neighbors, veterans, business leaders, and former students whose lives Naomi had impacted over the years. It was a room built from relationships rather than status. Marcus Carter sat quietly in the front row. Beside him sat Lily, swinging her feet beneath the chair with barely contained excitement. She had been talking about the wedding for weeks. Across the aisle sat Richard Whitmore. The difference between the man in the church and the man who had stood beneath the ballroom chandeliers months earlier was impossible to ignore. Pride still existed. Confidence still existed. But something softer had returned as well. Humility. The ceremony began with simple music and quiet smiles. No television cameras. No reporters. No headlines. Just family. When Naomi appeared at the entrance, the entire room stood. She looked elegant, but it was not the dress people noticed. It was her expression. Peace. The kind that comes when someone no longer feels the need to prove their worth. Ethan watched her walk toward him and felt the same certainty he had felt the day they first met. Not because of her father. Not because of her reputation. Because of who she was when nobody was watching. Halfway through the ceremony, Lily suddenly raised her hand. The minister paused. A ripple of laughter moved through the church. "Yes, Lily?" the minister asked. The little girl stood proudly. "I just wanted to make sure everybody knows this is the happiest day ever." Laughter filled the room. Naomi covered her face briefly while Ethan grinned. Even Richard laughed. "Thank you, Lily," the minister said. "That is very important information." The ceremony continued. The vows were simple. Honest. Personal. There were no dramatic promises. Only two people choosing each other with complete clarity. Afterward, guests gathered outside beneath bright blue skies. Children ran across the grass. Old friends shared stories. Music drifted through the afternoon air. At one point, Richard found himself standing beside Marcus overlooking the river. Neither spoke immediately. Sometimes silence says enough. Finally, Richard reached into his wallet. He removed a folded piece of paper that had clearly been opened many times. Marcus recognized it instantly. Lily's drawing. The same drawing from the gala. Richard smiled. "I carry it everywhere now." Marcus looked at the crayon figures and nodded. "Good reminder." Richard laughed quietly. "Best business advice I have received in years." Nearby, Ethan and Naomi watched Lily chase bubbles across the lawn. The little girl laughed each time one floated out of reach. Richard followed their gaze. "I almost lost all of this." Marcus did not disagree. "But you did not." Richard looked toward his son. "Only because they gave me another chance." As the sun began to lower across the river, guests slowly departed. The celebration ended the way meaningful days often do. Not with applause. Not with spectacle. With gratitude. Years later, people would still tell the story of that gala. Many would remember the surprise. Many would remember the revelation. But those closest to the truth remembered something else entirely. A wealthy man thought he was protecting his family's legacy. Instead, he discovered that legacy was never about money, influence, or status. It was about the people willing to stand beside you when all of those things mean nothing. Because some men spend a lifetime